The crimes, the criminals, why did they do it? Who got hurt? Did they meet justice or commit the perfect crime? You'll find all the clues at Jim Harold's Crime Scene. Welcome to the Crime Scene. I am Jim Harold, and so glad to talk with you once again. Now, when we talk about crime, many times on this program, we'll talk about violent crime. We'll talk about heists or murder or those sorts of things, serial killers. But today we're going to talk about a different type of situation, and this is more comes under the category of white-collar crime. And we're going to talk to Michael Kimmelman. He has a new book just out yesterday. Today is the 29th as we release this, and we record this on the 28th. And it's Confessions of a Wall Street Insider, a cautionary tale of rats, feds, and banksters. And Michael is a graduate of Lafayette College and the University of Southern California Law School. Formerly an associate at Sullivan and Cromwell, he was the founding managing partner of Incremental Capital, a New York-based hedge fund with over $250 million in assets. And then what we're going to talk about today happened. He is a serial entrepreneur, and he's currently consulting and launching new ventures in the culinary, retail, and entertainment spaces. He actively volunteers his time to several causes, including prison and education reform. Michael, welcome to the program today.
Thanks, Jim. Great to be here.
It sounds like in life, graduating from these great schools and these advanced degrees, you had a pretty good start. It sounds like for the first part of your career, everything was go gadget. Talk to us about Michael coming out of school and what you did and how you had such great success.
Yeah, I mean, I was a good student, I'll put it that way, not a great student. I certainly took advantage of growing up in Southern California and played sports and was outdoors quite a bit. So I was quite a good test taker, and my standardized test scores were very high. My grades not as high, just because I would attend school a little less frequently. But, you know, obviously did well enough to get into some good schools and did okay once I was at those schools. I, was on the law review at Southern California and interviewed my second year, as people are apt to do in law school, and got a job with Sullivan and Cromwell, which is, a pretty good law firm. And ended up working most of my third year at that firm and then transferring over to New York, the head office, because New York seemed to be the center of the action, so to speak, from the financial and legal world, and worked there for a few years and did mostly M&A work, some real estate work. But it was the late 90s, so to speak, and there were other people all around me probably working half as much as I was and doing things that were a lot more enjoyable in either the technology space or in the financial industry. So I decided to lateral and go over to finance.
Now, it sounds like, there were a lot of things going well. I mean, it sounds like you were probably compensated very well. If I understand correctly, we're kind of hobnobbing with the rich and famous and some names we recognize. It sounds like they were pretty heady times.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't lead a bad life. I had a pretty good marriage. I had 3 kids eventually, did well and, excelled at almost anything I did work-wise. And then sometime, obviously, after spending about 8 years in finance, 8 or 9 years, ended up starting my own fund and did that for a couple of years, and was tremendously successful doing that until November 5th, 2009, when the FBI arrived at my door.
Now, let's talk about this a little bit. You were convicted of insider trading. For people not familiar with that term and what it entails, what is the accusation of insider trading? What is, when the government says you're an inside trader, what are they accusing you of?
Sure. So the technical term is, they call it securities fraud. There really is no legal term insider trading that you'll find anywhere in, the statutes or the case law. It's a derivative of securities fraud. And what it essentially is, and it's kind of, interesting, and we could talk about it a little bit more further along, is that Congress has never defined insider trading. So it's grown out of a patchwork quilt of judge-made law. And what it really boils down to is there's about 4 or 5 elements that you need to have in order to be convicted of insider trading. You need to trade on material, non-public information that was acquired where somebody breached their fiduciary duty or duty of confidentiality and did that for a pecuniary benefit, and the trader has to have knowledge of this. So there's about 4 or 5 elements in total, and I'm happy to walk you through them real quickly if it helps the audience.
Please do.
All right, so knowledge is sort of self-explanatory. In the criminal law, knowledge is one of the cornerstones of criminal law. We don't throw people in prison and take away their liberty if they made a mistake or if there was something done by accident. There are some laws where knowledge is not required. Those are referred to as statutory laws. So you might be familiar with statutory rape, where if you have, sex with a minor, it doesn't matter whether you knew he or she was a minor. It's against the law, and that's a statutory definition. So knowledge is not required. But for the 99% of the crimes out there, you need knowledge in order to be convicted. Material just means that it's important, that it's likely to alter the total mix of information out there. So if a stock, if the Apple CEO sneezes or gets a minor cold, that's not material. But if they are in the process of rolling out a new iPhone that's, people are excited about, or they're going to do some other type of deal that will increase the stock value, that's material, meaning it will affect the stock price. Non-public is fairly explanatory on its own. It just means it's not widely disseminated or published, that it's not known by the broader market. It's more of a private thing. Now, in my case, there was a very unusual application of non-public, which we can talk about in a bit, in that the stock I traded, 3Com, was actually published in the Wall Street Journal. There was an article about 2 weeks before I received the call to buy the stock, and the Wall Street Journal literally had the exact details of what would happen several months later or a month or 2 later, in that, the company was going to be taken over, the bankers, who they were, who was the acquirer, and an approximate price. So in that case, you would think that's public, but the judge allowed the government to revert it back to non-public because in my case, my co-defendant, who was the one who had acquired the illicit knowledge, received a confirmation from a so-called insider. So by getting confirmation that a public story out there is true, they were able to convert it back to non-public, which, again, I don't disagree with. Having confirmation from an insider is obviously an advantage that somebody else doesn't have. It got very complicated, though, so to speak. But typically non-public just means nobody knows, or it's private, not public. And then in breach of a fiduciary duty for a pecuniary benefit gets a little more complicated. Essentially, you have the duty or responsibility to safeguard information. If you're an insider, you can't go around telling people what the private business of the company is. That's breaching your duty. If you're what's called, sort of an exaggerated insider, and where they apply the law to accountants, lawyers, bankers, people who have access to that insider's knowledge, an extended insider, so to speak, that falls under the misappropriation theory. But it essentially is the same thing. It means, hey, as a lawyer, we've entrusted you with this confidential information about the company. You're not allowed to share that for personal reasons, which is where pecuniary benefit comes in, because lawyers and bankers and other people do tip, or leak information, but they're doing it for their job purposes typically, either to hustle up competition if it's a bidding war, or for some other reason if there's a deal in trouble. So they are allowed to do that typically, but what they're not allowed to do is use the information for their own benefit. So you can't sell that information to somebody else who can profit off it. And that's what was happening in my case. There were 2 lawyers at Ropes and Gray who were selling information to an intermediary. That intermediary was then relaying the information to my partner. He was not my partner at the time, eventually became my partner, but my partner in the future, and he was using the information to trade on it, make a profit, as well as disseminate it to multiple parties.
So let me just throw out an example. If I understand insider trading correctly, let's say that I work for a defense contractor, an aeronautical firm, and through some virtue of my job, I'm in a position to know that my aeronautic firm is going to get a big multi-billion-dollar defense contract. But that is not knowledge to the general public. I go out and I buy 1,000 shares for my own benefit, knowing that the stock is probably going to go up when this contract is announced. That kind of thing, by definition, would be securities fraud and insider trading. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's a great example of what it would be.
Okay. So, but I mean, I read over a bit of the details of your case. I mean, it was based on a telephone conversation. Is that correct?
So, I mean, my case was, for lack of a better word, let's call it bizarre. Clearly it was during the height of the financial crisis and the height of the Occupy Wall Street movement. So there was a lot of societal pressure to find people who were responsible for this mess that the country found itself going through. It's not a secret. I've made it publicly known that I think the administration, along with the U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara, amongst others, came up with this narrative that, hey, rather than going after the real causes and the bad actors that were responsible for, if not causing, at least contributing to the financial crisis, it's going to be easier to go after insider trading because, A, it was out there for sure, but B, and more importantly, the cases are a lot easier to prove and a lot easier to make. Everybody's seen Wall Street, Oliver Stone's movie. Everybody understands, hey, you can't, bribe a lawyer or get a leak from the company. So these were, a convenient narrative, so to speak, was developed, and then cases were chosen to fit that narrative. This was, in my case, my partner was certainly guilty. There was about 9 people arrested in my case. He worked directly for Raj Rajaratnam, who was also arrested about 2 weeks earlier. Based on what I saw and heard at trial, Raj was certainly guilty as well as other people. But the things that my partner didn't always flow down to me, obviously. He was not my partner at the time. He tipped me on 3Com and basically told me, hey, smart guys are telling me, we should be long this thing. I'm buying it. I'm buying it aggressively. You should be there. There was nothing in his call that differed from the other, 100 or 200 calls he had given me. He was one of the guys I would constantly exchange ideas with. We were at separate firms at the time. At trial, we put up on a chart that, he gave me 387 trade ideas during that year. And the government really, substantively charged just this one stock, 3Com. And on 3Com, the government had anywhere from 1.5 to 2 years of wiretaps. There were body wires from 7 different informants, 500 hours of tape, tens of thousands of emails and instant messages. And sort of the best they could say was, Mike was too smart to get trapped on that stuff. But there was this one call we didn't record where Zvi called him and he must have told him about 3Com because he traded it the next day. And, it required a ridiculous leap in inference, an unconstitutional leap, because, the case law is clear. You can't build a case like that based on guesswork. You have to show actual knowledge and evidence. But it was enough. They've called one other witness who said he believes I was in a bar during happy hour, and I might have overheard an illicit conversation between my partner and this other trader. But on cross-exam, we said, are you certain he was there? He certainly heard, and he admitted he wasn't. But he thinks then if he didn't hear it, maybe he called or I called him, and, the phone records show I never spoke to him ever. But back in 2011, a case like that was enough. A jury convicted me. It was a jury who I don't think understood the law very well, and certainly was, more interestingly, incorrectly instructed by the judge. It turned out afterwards that we had a judge who has now been overruled in every single insider trading case that took place after mine, for giving incorrect jury instructions and basically omitting an entire element of the crime. So the Second Circuit has been very loud and gave a very public spanking both to that judge, Judge Sullivan, as well as Preet Bharara for, extending prosecutorial overreach to cases where insider trading and the application of it had never gone before. So there were a lot of very interesting parts about my case, but bottom line is it didn't matter. I was convicted and, went to prison for an extended period of time.
Well, two things. One thing, and I don't have a deep understanding of your case, but it seems like almost like being convicted on a game of telephone. One person told another person who told another person. And the thing is I could certainly understand where somebody might raise an eyebrow, 25-minute conversation with someone who probably had that inside knowledge, and then you buy a lot of shares the next day. However, a suspicion or a raised eyebrow usually wouldn't be enough for a conviction. That's what confuses me.
Sure. And it shouldn't be. In this country, we don't take away someone's life or liberty over, speculation or inferences or a could have known standard. Could have known has never been the standard. It's knowledge. In some cases, they might say should have known, but we've never even come close to could have known, which is really the standard the government espoused in my case, that somehow, I didn't do enough due diligence or detective work to determine the ultimate source of the tip. But that's completely unrealistic. Mm-hmm.
Well, let me give you an example. Let's say I have a stockbroker, and let's say that 2 or 3 people down the chain, there is somebody with inside knowledge on a particular stock. And that person tells another person who tells another person who tells my broker. Then I'm talking to my broker, and the broker says, I know it's a high price, but it's a great time to get on Apple stock. If I buy that stock and then it's found out that tip was eventually based on insider knowledge that I would have no way of knowing, couldn't I be convicted in the same way?
It sounds insane, but under the standard that they used in my case, you could. Obviously it depends on what each link in the chain is told and how it's relayed. So you're right. It is like a game of telephone. And in my case, you had this guy, Zvi, who was relaying it not just to me, but to, a dozen or 2 dozen other traders. And he wasn't out there relaying it, hey, I'm trying to bribe a friend who's trying to bribe a lawyer for information, because people would obviously look at him like he was crazy. And he would always, say, I'm not talking to any bankers or lawyers, don't worry, blah, 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 and sort of always phrased it as if it's coming from a smart hedge fund guy. He was very connected in the hedge fund space. He knew guys at Galleon and SAC and these other fast money big funds. And, frankly, it's never been, the tippee, that's who I am. I'm a remote tippee according to the law, to somehow trace back that tip to the origin. If you think about that, if your broker said, I love Apple, you got to be there. I'm hearing there's, great things happening. Let's buy a chunk. And you bought it, you wouldn't, most people wouldn't say, all right, I need to know where you're hearing that from. Right. I need their number. I need to confirm who he heard it from, who's a person you don't even know, right, and go down all the way to the origin of the tip. Especially because your network is a value. It has something of value, especially in the information industry or on Wall Street or any of these things. The people you talk to have a intrinsic value. So people aren't necessarily always likely to say, oh, yeah, I'll put you in touch with my, Galleon guy, because then they worry that they'll somehow be cut out of the equation, that if I can go directly to him, then I no longer need that intermediary and he becomes less valuable. So, it's kind of like if you heard from, you were at the coffee shop and you heard, hey, I heard Jim's cheating on, Sheila, and you would say, oh, okay, I need to know who said that. I need to track him down, and I'm going to determine each and every step down the way to find out if that's a true rumor. Like, that's a bit of a stretch, too. It's just not how people, operate. But in this case, there was nothing, this tip was no different than many of the other tips he had given me, of which, 9 out of 10 I probably lost significant money in, or a decent amount of money. It's on Wall Street, and especially on a trading desk, there's a swim at your own risk mentality. And, when I would press him for information or who's he getting it from, are you sure you're not talking to somebody? It would always be adamant that no, of course not. I know that's the only way to go to jail, and don't worry about it. It's none of your business who I'm talking to. These are my guys.
Right.
Either play it or don't play it, but it's not your problem. And again, I wouldn't just take his word for it. The tip itself or the call is the beginning of the research process. Then you go out and look at the company, you look at the charts, and you call other people. You do your own homework. And then, half the time I would take what I had heard and take the opposite position because I thought it was just disinformation from another hedge fund. And hedge funds would do this all the time for traders. If they had a very big position and there was bad news coming in the position, they would need to get out of that position. So without crushing the stock by selling it aggressively, they will leak a rumor saying there's good news coming out. Maybe it's better earnings or a new contract or a takeover. And as other people come in to buy that stock based on that rumor, they will sell into that additional buy momentum. And that is, again, it's a rumor. It's a false rumor. But, I got 5 or 6 rumors a week of the type that Zvi would give to us. And in this case, it was really no different. And there were certain parts of the case, like the actual one informant they called, who was the only informant on 3Com, who said, he thinks I might have been in a bar at happy hour and overheard it. He actually pled guilty, but refused to plead guilty to 3Com because even he said he didn't have inside information on it. So, that was one of these, pull your hair out moments where you're saying the government informant who's saying this guy knew about 3Com or the illegal information is refusing to plead guilty to 3Com because even he says there was no inside information. And, this was a guy who was a lot closer to Zvi than I was at the time. He sat next to him at the firm they were at. And you had, that's just one part of this case. There was another half dozen or dozen moments like this where any one of them should have been more than enough reasonable doubt or should have gotten the case dismissed at the summary judgment stage, which I do believe if it was brought today or if it was brought in 2005 and with any other judge, it would have never made it past summary judgment. The feds had an FBI informant sitting right next to me on the trading desk for 18 months wearing a wire, and they never even called him at trial. So think about that. This guy was trying to incriminate me every single day with, illicit information or conspiracy to do something illegal, and they ended up not even calling him at trial. So if something like that doesn't give you pause to say, all right, maybe this guy wasn't part of this massive conspiracy, it should have had the jury scratching his head. And there were other things like every one of the other co-defendants had a prepaid phone, a burner phone, as well as paid cash bribes. And the government admitted I was the only one that didn't do any of those things. So, I think what happened is they really didn't do their homework. They grabbed everybody. I had a good resume. This is probably an investigation the government spent 2 years and, $80 million on. And in the end, they pulled in a bunch of nobodies, except for, Zvi had worked at Galleon for Raj, so that was a big sort of headline. And then there was a bunch of, people nobody had ever heard from, but they could throw a lawyer in there who worked at Sullivan and Cromwell. So if I had not worked at Sullivan and Cromwell or had that on my resume, I actually think there's a good chance that they would not have arrested me. But unfortunately in the system, once you're a target and once you do get arrested, there's really nothing you can do to get out of the grips of the system. And, the government is sort of pot committed, so to speak, if you play poker. And they splashed me and everybody else on CNBC. So, even right after they indicted me, they said, look, your guy is radically different than anybody else here. Let him plead guilty to one count of conspiracy. We'll give him probation. He won't go to prison and get out of the case. And, maybe in retrospect or with perfect 20/20 hindsight, that was a deal I should have taken. But at the time, I didn't think I did anything wrong. And I wasn't about to stand up in front of a judge and perjure myself and say I absolutely knew, which I didn't.
Now, do you think this is a case? This is the scary thing. If the government, fairly or unfairly, decides they want to get you, they have unlimited resources, they have almost unlimited power. If they want to get you, they're going to get you.
Absolutely. And, I'll say this in certain audiences and environments, and it's really a very controversial thing, but I think if you give me 2 years and the resources of the federal government, I can arrest and convict anybody. And that's not a boast. besides the fact that almost everybody's done something, whether it's, drunken driving, or if you've downloaded music or played poker or bet on the Super Bowl, the federal regulations are something like 17,000 pages long now. There are all types of crimes that people have no idea there are crimes. And there's some excellent books out there about this, such as 3 Felonies a Day and other ones. But if they go and comb back and can look at your taxes, I mean, do you file your own taxes, Jim?
I have an accountant.
Exactly. Nobody knows how to file taxes. I'm a CFA and was a Wall Street guy, and I couldn't file my own taxes. So at the end of that, you may have an accountant prepare it, but you're the one that signs the return. So there were plenty of people in prison with me who had signed a return and didn't understand what their accountant did or what they were signing. But if you go back, you're still responsible for that. So there are a lot of inadvertent crimes, but with the government's resources, and if they're going to wiretap, and they wiretapped in my case, and they did a lot of illegal wiretaps in my case. But if they're going to wiretap and get defendants or co-defendants who, you can charge and say, you're going to face 10 years unless, you give us something on that person, that happens all the time. I mean, there are always defendants who are willing to get a plea deal or a better deal to say whatever the government wants them to say or whatever is needed to say in order to further a prosecution. But there are also many times where we just don't understand either what we're doing, or, if you taped everybody or looked at everybody's email, we're just starting to get more savvy about emails, especially after the DNC scandals and everything else. But I guarantee you've written an email or an instant message or something in the last 5 years that if I took it completely out of context and said, hey, he says he's going to kill this guy,
right,
that's conspiracy to commit murder. You may have been joking. And in our case, they took plenty of those comments out of context. And, where I'm talking with my partner about, this is going to be free money. And we're being sarcastic. We're joking. We're saying it's such a bad call, such a bad trading idea that we're going to get creamed. And we're saying, this is free money as a joke. But if you put that out of context, it sounds bad. Just like the one sort of big call they had with me, or the one body wire, there was another informant who was promising to write us a check for $10 million for our hedge fund. He had several meetings with my partner that I wasn't privy to, that I wasn't a part of. And somehow my partner had told him at those meetings, hey, I get a lot of my information from a friend and he's in the construction business or something like that. So this was now a meeting, all of us at a table, and he was repeating this ridiculous story of, first of all, the informant was being aggressive, trying to, get him to, incriminate himself, and was saying, I need to know where you get your information from. And Zvi said, look, I get it from, a construction guy, or I told you, and you don't need to know. It's my business. If the government ever asks you, that's my business, and he was being his normal sort of boastful self. But there was a guy drilling right outside the conference room for Con Edison in the street. And, the story was so ridiculous to me that I said, yeah, it's the guy out there drilling for Con Edison. And the whole room laughed. But they weren't laughing. They were laughing at Zvi for that ridiculous comment, which, again, was the first time I had heard it. But the government played that at trial, made a big deal, and even acknowledged it was a joke. But then at trial, they said, hey, it's, him trying to cover for Zvi. So, things like that out of context are very incriminating. It's a scary sort of environment that once you're a target, they have to justify the expense, the time of the investigation. Obviously, it's better for everybody's careers if it ends with a conviction, and that's why a lot of these insider trading cases were brought too, is because they're easier to bring, easier to convict versus some of the more complex financial cases. And if, the prosecutor wins, they get that 7-figure job at a big law firm and go right through that revolving door. So, it's a system that's not built on facilitating, attaining truth or justice. It's, unfortunately, career advancement is a major calculus, and it's about winning. Winning is sort of the be-all, end-all in these cases. And the sad part is, like I said, sometimes truth or justice gets trampled on the way out.
Now, we're running a little bit long, but this is fascinating. So if you have the time, we'll keep rolling with
I do. Absolutely.
In terms of going to prison, I mean, to me, that's one of the great, people say fear of death. And they talk about fear of public speaking. I say, what about the fear of going to prison? I mean, the thought of losing your freedom, and just, you have no recourse now, whether you're guilty or innocent. I mean, there have been a lot of people who have been put away who are innocent, and basically you're helpless, for the most part, in terms of getting out. You're just there. And, I think, the opposite of what many people think, prison is not a pleasant place. So talk to us about that whole experience and that process.
Yeah, no, it's a horrible experience. I've described it as barbaric, and I'll stick by that. It really is. I make the joke somewhat, is after I got out of prison, I went to a Bronx halfway house that was deep in the Bronx, a 5-floor walk up that was, I could tell you stories for weeks about that place, which was horrendous. And the only thing worse than that place was prison. So prison is a tough place. Obviously it should be tough. It's there for punishment, but it has to be more than just punitive. Especially since there are so many people, who facing, 10, 15-year sentences, just say whatever you want. I'll sign whatever you want. Just don't send me to prison for 10 or 15 years. 2 years, you want me to say this? Fine. So the 97 or 98% conviction rate that prosecutors have, think about it. Would you ever, in a fair adversarial system, expect there to be a 97% win rate for one side? Before a fair and impartial jury where both sides present evidence, it's impossible. You would never buy tickets to a sporting event, I always say, where one team wins 97% of the time. So there are a lot of people in prison who are wrongfully imprisoned and who are innocent. And that's why I think people, like the Innocence Project and some of these, legal aid appellate firms, pro bono operations are heroic to some degree. And look, just because, many people are wrongly imprisoned, some of them actually wear a suit. And it's less likely to be so, perhaps, because if you come from the white collar side, you may have the ability to have counsel, whereas 95% of the people in the drug cases either don't have counsel, or they have a public defender who's overwhelmed by his caseload, or they have incompetent counsel. So those people, and I can't tell you how many heartbreaking stories I saw while I was away pretending to be a disbarred but jailhouse lawyer helping people with their habeas corpus appeals, where you would say to a 21-year-old black guy who was maybe dealing crack, maybe just a lookout, maybe doing whatever he was doing, but, didn't kill anybody, and took a 15-year first-time non-violent offense at the age of 18, 19, or 20, and you looked at his, papers, and you said, oh, you had a gun on you. I didn't have a gun on me. I was like, well, you signed a plea that said you had a gun on me. He's like, I didn't read the plea. My lawyer said to sign it. And you would see things like that all the time. So it's a system that, obviously there's always been that word or term out there of rich man's justice, and that exists to a degree. I do think there is a level of wealth and power in this country that's, if not quite immune from the law, certainly it's a lot harder to touch them. And then there's a level down where you may be able to pay and afford for counsel, but you're still at a distinct disadvantage because the government has endless resources, and they do have, a system that institutionally is incredibly prejudiced in their favor. I'm talking about everything from showing up and it's the United States versus Michael Kimmelman. It's not the IRS versus Michael Kimmelman. Everybody hates the IRS. So, you got a somewhat of a fair chance there, but everybody loves the United States. I grew up, Star Spangled Banner was my favorite song. Baseball, apple pie, Ronald Reagan. Who doesn't love these things or their country? I think most people still feel affection that way. So when you hear, it's the United States, it's the good guys. And the FBI agents would taunt, during the case and, to friends or whoever, like, come play for Team America, or that's what they, when they're trying to recruit people, it's Team America. So you want to be with the good guys and the good team. And I think the jury, that has a very powerful impact, as well as you're wearing American flag lapels on their suits. And then you walk into a courtroom, and behind the judge, there's an emblem of an eagle. And there is all this, symbology that basically lets you know which team you're supposed to be rooting for. And at base, you also have a judge who is a prosecutor. All judges are former prosecutors. Some of them are, frankly still prosecutors, and act as a sixth man for the government, as Judge Sullivan did in my case, by letting the government jump over a lower hurdle to prosecute and basically omitting an entire element of the crime. But you have a judge who makes it clear which team is the good guys and which team is the bad guys. And we just happen to have a case where he took it to such an extreme from, almost giving the FBI case agent a hug before he came up to the witness stand and, joking with him about, oh, you're from Norway, I'm from the old country too, and how about this? And, validating and giving the witness extra credibility to, during closing arguments, he literally shushed my lawyer because, I had mentioned to my lawyer during closing arguments the prosecutors were saying things that were patently untrue and mischaracterizing testimony from an informant who had actually testified favorably to me and said, it was not inside information. And they were saying this informant said it was inside information. And I said to my attorney, don't we have to object to that? That's a flat out lie. And as we were discussing it, Judge Sullivan interrupted and literally shushed my lawyers and basically dressed them down like they were kindergartners and said, you will show some respect to the government. They're making their closing statements. They respected you. It was outrageous in almost every single way. But that's the uphill battle anybody fights if they do become a target.
It's like something out of a movie. I've got to imagine the day that you walk into prison knowing that it's for whatever your term is, it's a permanent thing, and you hear those bars close. I mean, that just has to be just a horrible moment.
I mean, I think it is and it isn't. Actually, walking into prison for me was one of the better moments because I had a sort of Damocles dangling over my head for 2 years. And that's what people don't understand. It's not an episode of Law and Order where it's start to finish 42 minutes without commercials and you get justice or at least you get some conclusion. In this, I was arrested in 2009. I didn't go on trial until mid-11, so 2 years later. After I was convicted, I didn't get sentenced for another 6 months. So when I finally walked into prison, and knew that I was facing 30 months in prison, I at least said, I could look at a calendar and say, if I play my cards right, if I'm, good behavior, if I do everything perfectly, I will be home and this will be behind me at this date. So it had removed some of the uncertainty because there was a lot of uncertainty. I mean, my lawyers felt I could possibly get 1 year. At most they thought maybe 2, and then 3 was an option maybe. But the government, obviously was asking for a much larger sentence because I exercised my right to go to trial. And that's another good point for your audience. Think about that. I was offered probation, non-jail probation, if I took a plea. At worst, it would have meant 6 months of home confinement. By going to trial and exercising my constitutional right to go to trial, I received 30 months from the judge. So what changed that I should have gotten a sentence 5 times what the original offer was, other than going to trial? So, there are little things like that people don't understand. And again, I understood nothing of it. From the time of my arrest, which was a surprise, to, the time I reported to prison, there was every single thing that came up. That's why I took so much, I was just taking notes like crazy and ended up starting writing this book because I was shocked or stunned by so many different parts of the criminal justice system. And again, remember, Jim, I'm not just a guy who watched Law and Order. I went to law school. I was a practicing attorney for several years. And every step of the way, I said that cannot possibly be true or how it works or the system. Point. Blown away.
Now, so you get out of prison. I mean, your marriage didn't survive prison. Is that correct?
Unfortunately, it didn't. I'm still very close to my ex. She's a fantastic mother, and a great person. But, in a situation like this, with the amount of public pressure and stress that it creates, it could either sort of bring you together or pull you apart. And I think to some degree we let it pull us apart. So it did not survive prison. My ex-wife or wife at the time actually served me while I was in prison. And it was a extremely tough time for both of us. But I think prison hammers home more than anything else that it's not just the defendant or the inmate that gets punished, that it's really the family and the children that bear the brunt of that punishment. So, it was extremely hard on her. And, for people who are critical of that, I say, you have to walk a mile in her shoes to understand what that was like. But, unfortunately, it did not survive.
And, you get out, what do you do and what are you doing today? I mean, it seems like since you have this conviction on your record, that's got to hinder you in terms of a lot of the things you can do professionally and personally. And also, I believe you're trying to get this either overturned or somehow minimized. Talk to us about that and what you're doing today.
Sure. And just a quick intro note, you're 100% right. And that's one of, the areas that I'm trying to be active in on the reform front, is that it's not like it was 50 years ago or 30 years ago. This is the age of Google. So really any felony conviction is a life sentence. And with technology, it's so easy to do a background check. There are 95% or whatever the number is of industries or jobs that are now foreclosed to you, many of which shouldn't be. I mean, there's no differentiation between a guy who gets busted, for having a couple of grams of marijuana on him versus a guy who murdered somebody. You're a convicted felon that comes up in a background check and you're instantly foreclosed. So there's a lot about that that's wrong and upsetting and non-productive from a societal point of view. But that's a separate conversation. With regard to me, I realized that fairly quickly and, may have been overqualified for certain posts, but realized that there was not going to be a chance to pursue a Fortune 500 company or go work for Goldman Sachs or anywhere else. So you got to do it on your own. And I've always been an entrepreneur at heart from, forming my firm and doing other things. So I hit the ground running on that stuff. On the creative front, I just finished writing a sitcom pilot with a friend that is pretty good. It's a tragic comedy, and it's actually really funny. So putting the finishing touches on that, and we'll begin shopping that. I'm also producing a documentary in the true crime space, which I'd love to come on again or talk to you about at some point. That's going to be phenomenal. It's, it's about the intersection between Scores, which is a very famous New York nightclub, sort of an iconic institution.
Yeah, Howard Stern.
Exactly. Howard Stern, the Yankees, the Knicks, everybody was there. Leo DiCaprio, Mark Wahlberg, you name it. And the owner of Scores actually did one of the biggest insurance frauds of all time, got caught, agreed to wear a wire on the mob, who were really the people who were running Scores. It was the Gambino crime family and John Gotti Jr. and wore a wire on the mob for about 2 years. And at the end of the 2 years, there was a giant indictment that basically brought down the Gambino crime family. So it's all about that. We've got all the key players, a lot of past footage, and some other stuff on it. It's going to be great and very entertaining. Career-wise, I've been busy targeting investment opportunities in real estate with an investor group, mostly in the Southeast, which demographically is still very strong and a great area to put money to work. I've been doing some coaching and some speaking gigs, and also have been consulting for several cannabis companies in Colorado that are doing, some really great stuff in the medical and therapeutic space. I mean, they're literally changing people's lives for the better with some of these products. And, that's a generational thing. Despite some of the noise coming out of Washington, I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. On the personal side, I spend as much time as I can with my kids, coach their sports, be their dad, the good things in life. And as you mentioned, on the legal front, I intend to see the appeal process to the end. Judge Sullivan was flat out wrong in my case. There's no debate there. Both the judge and Preet have acknowledged that he did give the wrong jury instructions and basically omitted an element of the crime. You'd think they'd be the bigger person and take the high road and vacate the conviction, especially after I went away and served prison time for a crime I didn't commit, but they haven't, and they've hung their opposition on a procedural technicality, that I didn't timely file the motion to keep from doing the right thing. But there shouldn't be a time clock on justice. So I'll keep fighting and hope that justice will prevail in the end.
Well, it's been a fascinating conversation. Our guest has been Michael Kimmelman. The book is Confessions of a Wall Street Insider, a cautionary tale of rats, feds, and banksters. And Michael, where can people find the book?
Amazon, Barnes & Noble, independent bookstores. It's everywhere today. You can get it online if you prefer the electronic version, but it's really, you can get it anywhere, or, you can go to www.michaelkimmelman.com, which is the website, and there's links on there, or I'm on Twitter at Mike Kimmelman, and there's links there pretty much anywhere. So, I hope people pick it up, and I think they'll enjoy it, especially it's not just a book for Wall Street people or legal people. I've heard that it has a much broader appeal, and I've actually had a lot of, women and others come to me that are not in the industry and say they've enjoyed it tremendously.
Well, I've enjoyed our talk, and thank you for coming on the show, and look forward to speaking with you again in the future on your other projects. Thanks again, Michael.
Really appreciate it, Jim. Thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that show as much as I did. It was fascinating to get Michael's take on this, kind of maybe a different perspective than maybe we would expect, and certainly interesting. And we thank him for his time, and we thank you for your time tuning into The Crime Scene. We'd appreciate it if you could subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. You can rate it and review it. When we do these programs, we introduce different series, and we continue with the things that people show that they like by subscribing, by rating, and by reviewing. And if you like the show and you want it to keep going great guns, and we have every intention to do so, but we do need to see audience growth. And the way we see that is if you can please go ahead, rate, review, and subscribe. Vote with your ratings, with your reviews, and your subscriptions, and we'll keep going. I thank you so much for tuning in to The Crime Scene, and as always, be careful out there. Bye-bye, everybody.